All right, thank you very much, Amelia. Let me just say a couple of things. Many of you, I think I know Professor Jacoby very well, and it's my pleasure to introduce him briefly. You know that he's remarkable in many ways. One of those is as a scholar. He's Mary Luton Fulton Professor of Political Science here at BYU, and he's written widely on topics regarding European and especially German politics. It's interesting that in an interview he gave a few years ago, when he was asked what led him to political science, he actually specifically mentioned 1989 and the fall of the Berlin Wall, the collapse of communism, wanted to understand how that happened. And so he has written quite a bit. Let me just mention two books here that are relevant to our topic today. Imitation and Politics, Redesigning Modern Germany, which came out by Cornell University Press in 2000. And then The Enlargement of the European Union and NATO, Ordering from the Menu in Central Europe, published by Cambridge University Press in 2004. Right? So you can see he's thought a lot and written a lot about the aftermath of the collapse of communism in Europe. His students know that he's a remarkable teacher and also a terrific storyteller. We may see some of that today. He's an avid outdoorsman. In that same interview, when asked how he liked being in Utah, he said, I'm quoting here, "The fishing and bow hunting are unbelievable." Okay? He's been involved a good deal in the Kennedy Center over the years. He's also a terrific friend and colleague, and we're very happy to have him here today, so please join me in welcoming him.
Thanks very much, Stan. Thanks, Amelia, for the prayer. I'm so stoked that so many of you are here. About 15 minutes ago, my daughter called me. My youngest daughter, I could never get her on the phone. And she said, "What are you doing?" I said, "I'm running off to give a talk right now." She said, "What's it on?" I said, "It's on 30 years after the collapse of communism." And she said, without missing a beat, "Will anybody be there?" I'll be very happy to report that at least 50 people were there later on. On the night of August 13th, 1961, the Berlin Wall goes up about 2 o'clock in the morning. The idea is, as we heard last week actually in a lecture, to make sure that when the wall goes up the middle of the night, you can minimize the number of people who are going to be cut off from the side of the city in which they're currently living. Berlin is a city in which people move back and forth reasonably fluidly, though not without difficulty. Members of a family that we'll meet later in the talk, my host family, about the same time are having some really interesting experiences. For one, they've just been challenged by someone in their apartment building. They were caught moving a dresser in a car that they had, and immediately suspicions were raised that they were moving that dresser because they were getting prepared to leave for West Berlin. Now, they had a story, and the story was coherent enough that the police let them go. The story was that new members of the family had just gotten permission to live in East Berlin. You had to get permission to live there. And that they were dividing the family furniture, as it were, to give these new folks from one of the other territories a new start in life. And because they had a permission for someone to move in, the story sort of passed muster. But in fact, they were gathering their possessions to move to West Germany. For several months, they had been moving silverware and pictures and clothing and small trips to make sure that no suspicious neighbors caught too much wind of it. I like to think of it as a kind of Andy Dufresne of household appliances, sort of scattering them surreptitiously in places in West Berlin when they knew that they would make a break to live there, which indeed they did, and I'll come back to that family a little bit later. Here's what the Berlin Wall ultimately looked like in schematic form. You can see on your right-hand side, East Berlin. There's a kind of chain link operation that starts the thing. There's some physical barriers. There are watchtowers. There's a road. There's then this second wall. So if you were to approach the wall, as I did, visiting West Berlin as an undergraduate student, you would see that concrete barrier with a pipe on top that made it hard to climb over if you were lucky and or crazy enough to get that far. And that side of the wall was the one that was painted in West Berlin because people could walk right up to it and decorate it if they wanted to. I was going to bring a piece of the Berlin Wall today, but I forgot to do that. That was a mistake. People tried lots of ways to get over this wall during the many years of its existence. Here's a still from a film from a 1970s escape where two families kind of got together, built a balloon, and flew over the wall. There was a later version of this in 1989. Just a few months before the wall came down, a husband and wife had built their own homemade balloon, smaller than this, and they were filling it in the middle of the night for their escape when they were discovered by security forces. And as security forces raced up in a Jeep, they had the balloon about 3/4 filled, and they got into it, but it wasn't buoyant enough to lift them both off the ground. So the wife climbed back out, cut the husband loose, off he went, over the wall, in fact, but unfortunately hit a power line on the other side probably and fell to his death. She was arrested and spent about the next 7 or 8 months in prison until the wall actually came down, at which point it wasn't clear what she was in prison for, and she was released. Lots of crazy stories about those early years. The first death in the Berlin Wall happened right after it went up. Just a few months later, a woman whose apartment balcony was right on the line tried to jump from her 4th floor window and didn't survive the fall. Some funnier stories, the one that I like, and the only one that I'll tell now, is that there were 2 little boys in a similar situation where their apartment building abutted the wall. Now, the wall did not look like this at that time. It was a barbed wire contraption augmented by bricks and mortar, and it was just one wall. And these 2 kids had been in the habit before the wall went up of going to Kudamm, which is in the west, and watching cowboy movies, Roy Rogers movies on Saturdays. They would get the matinee and watch the double feature and then go back to East Berlin. And when the wall went up, as little boys are maybe inclined to do, they thought there should be no real impediment to our enjoyment of American cinema. And so they found ways to climb down a rain gutter, and they would go over into the western side and go to their Saturday movies as before. And they continued doing this right up until the day when the movie theater manager talked to them and then heard their story and then blabbed it to a reporter who then printed it in the newspaper. And the next day, the GDR authorities showed up at their door. Their parents were in big trouble. The apartment building got bulldozed, and that particular hole in the wall was closed. But the story I want to use to kind of frame the first part of my talk is, in fact, about Bruce Springsteen. This is a book by Eric Kirschbaum, an American historian, who writes about Springsteen's show in East Berlin, the one and only show he did in East Berlin in 1988. The communists were having a lot of difficulty in this period, and one problem was that young people wanted to hear rock and roll music, and the big stars were in the West and not in the East. So they tried a couple of things. David Bowie had caused a sensation when he came to West Berlin, and too many East Berlin people had moved right up close to the wall, and as a consequence freaked out the security forces. So they said, we got to get some stars to come to East Berlin where we can manage the situation as we want to manage it. And they got Bryan Adams, the Canadian guitar player. That was kind of good. They got Bob Dylan, who was a very big name, but maybe not a riveting performer, even though his music was well known to the people in the crowd. But Springsteen was sort of the big get. He was a big star already at that point, and a big star in Europe. And he was doing his Tunnel of Love tour, which I actually saw in Frankfurt that year. And I had been in the GDR that week and had tickets to the show in Frankfurt, and had left some home and garden magazines in the trunk of my buddy's car. We had meant to give them to our hosts in East Germany, and when we were leaving the East German border guard station, they found these magazines. They were just like whatever, how to grow more tomatoes and, 14 ways to dress up your table for Halloween or whatever. And we were in big trouble. They sort of dismantled half of our car and gave us the pieces back again afterwards. So I missed the first 4 songs of this concert that night. Complete outrage. But in '88, he came to East Berlin, and it was quite a show. They had printed up tickets under the name Concert for Nicaragua, as you can see here if you speak some German, or I guess that's probably close enough that even if you don't speak German, you'll believe me. Springsteen found out that it had been heavily politicized by the Communist Party because the Nicaraguans were allies of the GDR Social Unity Party, the SED, and he wasn't happy about that. He didn't want to play under a political banner. And so in a clip I'm going to show you in just a second, he sort of says that. He's going to say in the worst possible German, for those of you who speak German, I apologize on Bruce's behalf. He'd like to do better. He basically says, I'm not here for or against any government. I'm just here to play rock and roll. And later in the show, though, he does a very political thing. He takes out a piece of paper that's been written by a guitar tech in East Germany, and he reads a statement that Springsteen asked him to translate into German. And that statement includes the words, "I look forward to a day when all the barriers will be torn down." Now, originally he had all the walls will be torn down, and the roadie kind of convinced him that if he did that, they'd probably shut the concert down right there. So he changed it to the word barriers. But he didn't say fall down or come down. He says abgerissen, will be torn down. And so it's a moment that the people in the stadium really can't miss. Now, speaking of the people in the stadium, the Communist Party printed about 160,000 tickets for this, which would have been the biggest show he'd ever done. They gave out these tickets through a variety of Communist Party organizations, including the Freie Deutsche Jugend, the youth organization of the Communist Party, was the main way of getting the tickets into people's hands from all over the country. So 160,000 tickets were sold. 260,000 people came at least. And this is the moment that I want to kind of focus on for just a moment, ask you to kind of imagine what it might be like to grow up in a totalitarian society where personal freedom is not non-existent, but it's limited. And one thing it limits it is interaction with the authorities, with the police, with the military, with security forces. That's the kind of thing that scares you and makes you take a step back. And on this day, when there's 260,000 people in the crowd, some of them have tickets and some of them don't, and they're standing together with their buddies. So maybe Rolla has a ticket and Liam doesn't have a ticket, but they're there together, and they're in this huge group, and they're being pushed forward. And you know what it's like to be part of a crowd. You can't just stop. When the crowd moves, you move, and you just go with this organism. And that's what happened. But there were security checkpoints set up all around the concert venue, which was a big racetrack, a big horse track in East Berlin, way, way away from the wall. And people just couldn't stop at the checkpoints. And so they just smashed over these barriers. They, as a big crowd, they just kind of trampled everything. And Kirschbaum suggests that there's a moment there where for a lot of people in that crowd, it's the first time they ever imagined themselves as powerful. The first time they ever imagined the possibility of defying the authority of the state. Even if it's as minimal as a policeman saying, hey, you have to stop and let me check your ticket. There was no way to do that. And he says, in addition to the musical experience and the things that Springsteen said that day, people came away with a collective understanding that something was different about their lives. And he talked to dozens and dozens of people who were there that day, and it was clearly a profound and meaningful experience for lots of them. I'll just give you a flavor of it. Do we have that clip that we can bring up? This is going to show you the first minute or so of this clip will give you Springsteen's bad German, give you a sense of how large the crowd is, and then he'll go into playing the first part of Dylan's Chimes of Freedom. So if we can get that up on the screen, you'll be treated to some of the worst German you will ever hear. There we go.
Es ist schön in Ostberlin zu sein. Ich möchte euch sagen, ich bin nicht hier für oder gegen irgendeine Regierung. Ich bin gekommen, um Rock'n'Roll zu spielen für Ostberlin. In der Hoffnung, dass eines Tages alle Barrieren abgerissen werden. Ich danke euch.
Okay, so that's Springsteen in East Berlin. The question I want to ask, and the first question that I want to think about is, what's become of that feeling of possibility? Now, by no means, and we'll come back to our slides here, by no means do I want to suggest that this moment was the moment that brought down the East German government. That would be completely silly, and Kirschbaum doesn't make that argument either. Instead, and I want to point out that there were a lot of things. This is a picture of Neues Forum in Leipzig and the Monday demonstrations that started in September of '89 inside of a church where every Monday people would get together and demonstrate publicly. They'd start in the church, they'd go out in the public square and demonstrate against the government. And so this culminated after about 14 or 15 weeks in the events in November that you read about a lot this week, where the wall comes down in some sense accidentally. In November of 1989. So the Springsteen moment is just one moment among many, and the question really is sort of what do East Germans make of this opportunity for voice? And so I want to give you just a moment to sort of look at the voice situation in East Germany. And first of all, if you just look at the parties that East Germans vote for, they're different from the parties that West Germans vote for. Instead of the two big centrist parties dominating things with the smaller parties being clustered down below, you've got, again, pretty good representation from the CDU, but the SPD is in real trouble in Eastern Germany. Meanwhile, the AfD, the Alternative for Germany, the right-wing party, the far-right party, I don't call them a neo-Nazi party, but a far-right party, I think is certainly fair, has certainly seen a surge in West Germany, but nothing like the surge they've seen in East Germany. The predecessor to the Communist Party barely registers in the western side, the Linke, and they have, as you can see here, had quite a career in East Germany. So definitely a story in which East Germans and West Germans vote for different parties. East Germans don't turn out as much as West Germans do. The gap's only about 5 to 8%, but it probably helps explain part of this difference, because when we hit lower turnout, we typically get more extremism. One of the real interesting things, though, is that when you look at the coalitional possibilities in Germany, in East Germany, they're really shrinking away to almost nothing. So what this chart shows you is the years of certain elections on this vertical axis, right down to our last one in fall of 2017. And it shows you the common coalitions, the Grand Coalition, red, red, green, red, red, what the Germans call Jamaica, black and yellow, and what the Germans call the traffic light coalition. These all have to do with the party colors of the various factions in Germany, and they don't need to detain us a lot. What I want you to focus on is how in the early years you could get 1, 2, 3 possibilities mathematically, 3, 3, 3, 4, I'm sorry, 3, 3, 2, and 0. So what that tells you is that if all of Germany voted the way that East Germany did, we couldn't mathematically have a government unless we started including coalitions with the AfD or the far-right party. And so there is the fragmentation of the party system in East Germany is something that a lot of us are worried quite a lot about. This fragmentation didn't come from nowhere. It didn't start with the asylum problem, but the asylum problem since 2015 and Angela Merkel's Wir schaffen das has definitely hit like a bombshell in Eastern Germany. This shows you that East German states, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of them, plus Berlin, have fewer refugees in general than West German states do. And you can see the coding up there. But notwithstanding the fact, and here's another way of looking at it. This gives a different color to all 16 German states. Here's what the map actually looks like. And tries to imagine what would it look like if we just saw the number of refugees. And you can see that these East German states, again, have small numbers because the state size shrinks, whereas the size of this state goes up quite a lot. And the size of tiny little Bremen goes up a large amount because it's got the highest ratio of refugees to native population. So those two slides clearly show that there's not a lot of refugees in East Germany. There are very few, except in Berlin. But the AfD, the far-right party, is doing much better in Eastern Germany, notwithstanding the low number of refugees. I won't go to this in detail, but I'll point out that Saxony down here is showing upwards of a quarter of the vote to almost a third of the vote going to the AfD, and the AfD is clearly doing extremely well in all 5 Western states, though not so much in Berlin, where the percentage is orange, which translates to 10 to 15%. So the AfD is doing very badly in northwestern Germany, doing very well in eastern Germany, and somewhere in between in what you might broadly call southern Germany. Here's the incidence of violence against refugees. On the top, you see the absolute numbers, and you see high numbers in Saxony, 51 in 2016 alone, and in North Rhine-Westphalia, much more populous state, 55. So the bottom tries to standardize this by 1 million inhabitants and shows you that all 5 of the eastern states, Saxony, Saxon-Anhalt, Mecklenburg, West Pomerania, Thuringia, and Brandenburg, are by some distance the places where refugees are most likely to be violently assaulted. This shows you the share of foreigners against the vote for the AfD. And the blue numbers, the darker blue numbers show low incidence, and the green numbers show high. So again, we see the same story, relatively low number of refugees, but relatively high vote share of the AfD. This is the same story on a different kind of a plot. The black dots are East Germany, and the yellow dots or yellow triangles are West Germany, or Old West Germany. And this shows the 300 electoral districts in the country and shows very clearly that there's a cluster of places that have extremely low foreign share of population, maybe 3, 4, 5% in here, but very high vote shares for the AfD. Again, in some districts, approaching 40%. Similarly, we have lots of places that are yellow that, broadly speaking, have roughly at or above the average and lower vote shares for the AfD. So we've got a negative relationship between those two. We could talk more about the far-right protests in Chemnitz, but maybe just some images from some of those protests. Dresden recently announced itself to be in the middle of an AfD emergency. And I think I'll finish this section of the talk with the Halle synagogue shooting, which many of you heard about. A young man took a semi-automatic weapon to a synagogue in Halle, tried to live stream it with a camera on his helmet. It was kind of a mess up from the very beginning. He was not very well organized. He's trying to live stream this whole thing in English. He gets very stressed out. He shoots a tire on his own car. He fires a bunch of times into the lock of the synagogue, but the synagogue had been reinforced recently and the door holds. He tries to set off homemade explosives. They don't work very well. In the end, one woman passerby dies what I think of as the most German death imaginable. She yells at the kid for making too much noise, so he shoots her. The Springsteen point here is at some point in the 1980s, East Germans acquired a voice. And my worry is this, that if East Germans vote for radical parties, it's not clear how long their voice will still matter. The West German parties are making, the West German parties, that's the wrong way to say it. The traditional German parties have hard choices to make. At a certain point, if the East German electorate moves too far away from where those parties can win votes in the West, those Western parties might abandon those voters altogether. That will increase the vote share for the radicals. Indeed, that dynamic may have already kicked in for reasons that we'll get to. But that's the dilemma. What happens if you find your voice, get your voice, feel your own power, but you end up voting for parties that are extreme enough that the rest of the country just sort of says, we should just ignore those guys? All right. Well, let's move to the second part of the talk. What Donald Trump can teach us. So, you know that they have an uncomfortable relationship. I don't think I need to go into that in any kind of great detail. But I want to talk about the German economy in the following way. The German economy, from Trump's perspective, sells too much to the rest of the world. They don't buy enough from the rest of the world. And what I want to suggest is that his way of looking at it is somewhat confused, but that there is a point underneath it all. Let me try to explain what that point is. Let me start by saying, when we do trade, the Germans like to talk about, we have really good products, and because the euro is weak, they're at a really good price, so why wouldn't people buy those? And that's an entirely legitimate point of view. I don't want to contest either of those things. They're both true. But I want to say there's something else that matters a lot when we think about trade, and that is how much money do you have in your pocket? So when you go look at a product, you don't just ask, is it a good product and at a good price? You ask the question, do I have the money for it? And one way to think about the German economy is that over the last 15 years, they have systematically transformed their economy to make sure that a lot of their population doesn't have enough money in their pockets to buy the goods of other countries. In other words, the inequality in Germany has gone up a long ways. And it's that inequality that's really the problem in Germany and for others. It's the part the president doesn't really get, but as I said, he is on to something. Let me see if I can explain what's going on. First of all, here's the story that he's angry about. And by the way, Obama was angry about this too. This plots simply the share of Germany's current account surplus against its GDP. Typically, we expect countries to kind of fluctuate right around that zero mark for all kinds of reasons we can get into. We think of surpluses as being kind of a temporary thing. In Germany, you can see that this is kind of the historical pattern, that Germany has been in a positive territory, but less than 2% of GDP. But in 2003, it starts to climb, and it jumps a big chunk here. It has another jump here, and arguably another jump here until it gets above 8%. And at this point, lots of countries, not just the United States, start to really worry about this. Well, why should they worry about it? I mean, from a German perspective, they shouldn't worry at all. So here's how Germans think about that surplus. It's a result of market actions. Free choices of consumers buying terrific products. Policy didn't cause it, and if we change our policy in Germany, that won't really change the current account surplus. It doesn't hurt anybody. No one's putting a gun to people's head and say, buy a Mercedes. People buy a Mercedes because they want a high-quality car at a decent price. It's a trade issue that really should be a non-issue. I'm not sure what the Americans are complaining about, what the other Europeans are complaining. The French complain about this a lot too. And I would say this diagnosis is broadly shared across the German policy space. So here I've got the main parties in government right now, the other main sort of free market party. I would say most economists, virtually all the German media, the central bank, the Council of Economic Advisors, everybody kind of shares the same diagnosis. Let me give you a different way to think about this. That what Germany is engaged in is a current account surplus that results from its inability to buy things from abroad. And that really is a problem. So Germany has a big savings surplus. What's happened is the government is in the black, it's saving a lot, and firms are having record profits, and they're sitting on mountains of cash for reasons we could get into. Households actually haven't changed their saving behavior very much, but the first two are big enough that Germany is saving a lot of money. Now that's not a problem if you want to invest it. High savings are fine if they're invested at home. And if they're invested abroad with people who need the investment capital, that's also fine. There have been lots of cases where foreign capital has helped another country that's been able to receive that capital. Unfortunately, sometimes those financial flows can cause asset prices to inflate. We call these things bubbles. If any of you are like young married couples thinking about buying your first house in the Provo market, welcome to an asset price bubble. It's really tough to do that right now. Even if you're paying rent, you're probably struggling more than your older brothers and sisters did when they were here in Provo. So unproductive bubbles are a major worry. There are alternatives to bubbles. If the United States is facing an inflow of German savings, or Chinese, or Japanese, or Korean, it doesn't matter the nationality, we can adjust in various ways. We can invest that money, wisely or unwisely. I've just gone over those options. Our other two options are not very attractive. We can use that money to fund a consumption boom, but at the cost of much increased debt in our country. And I say our country, but this is true for the Spanish if they take German money, or the British if they take German money, any country that does that. Because that gets our savings down. When we spend a lot, we're getting our savings down, think of it that way, to adjust for savings coming in from abroad. That works until people stop lending us the money. If you're 18, you probably got a whole bunch of credit card solicitations arriving at your parents' house telling you to open a cravings account or whatever it is, whatever the marketing slogan of the month was. That's a reflection of the fact that our capital markets in this country are deep and open and anonymous. We don't ask a lot of questions and legally protected. So lots of people who have legally gotten gains and illegally gotten gains want to park their money here. And it does crazy thing with our asset prices in this country. So the alternative to bubbles is a consumption boom, or the last alternative is unemployment. That's a great way to get your savings down. And it works every time. Just go unemployed. You'll get your savings right down. So we have a serious macroeconomic problem in this country. And that's one of the reasons President Trump is the president, because he was the guy who more clearly than most of the others said, no, the system is broken. Now, how it's broken, I think, is beyond him. That's okay. he has pointed out that there is an economic relationship between our countries that is troubled. Well, what does this have to do with East Germany? GDP per head in East Germany is 80% of that in West Germany. That was true 15 years ago. East Germany is less industrial, so the system based upon industrial exports, cars and machine tools, doesn't benefit the East Germans nearly as much. They have fewer chances for high value-added production in their part of the country, and therefore they have a higher share of low-end service jobs. But that's the other side of the German model, right? You're really pushing capital subsidies toward exporting firms, but the counterpart of that is your people on the low end of the labor market, they're really getting pounded. There are no wage gains. There's very little, there's a lot of inequality. East Germany has more people in precarious jobs, a higher percentage of social service recipients. By the way, if you want to drive your national savings up, which Germany has done, you have to cut your welfare state costs. So all the social service provision has been softened, and that includes for people in West Germany too, but East Germany has a higher percentage of social service recipients. And finally, East Germans have less wealth. So the Trump point is this: Germany's system builds on income and wealth inequalities, and it deepens them further. And this matters because Eastern Germany gets fewer of the benefits of that system. It has fewer exporting firms and has more citizens who suffer the downside of that system. So the way the German economy has transformed in the last 15 years is out of step with German history. It would not have been possible without the euro. That's a complicated conversation about why that is. But the German economy we see today is not the German economy we saw 20 years ago. It is both better and worse. It is a manufacturing juggernaut, but you can only get that system if you're repressing domestic consumption at home. And that hurts East Germans a lot. Not surprising that there's a lot of unhappiness there. I want to finish with just a couple comments about my host family. I want to leave time for questions, so I'm going to go a little quickly on this. This family that I introduced earlier came from Schwerin, which became part of Poland, so they had to leave, and from a little town in the Harz region called Wernigerode, and that part of the family chose to leave East Germany. And they both left for powerful, important reasons, and they settled in Cologne, which is about as far in West Germany as you can get. And that older generation, which I got to know as a student in the 1980s, that older generation kept very close ties to home. It was tough for a while because my host's mother had left secretly, and her father didn't talk to her for about 10 years afterwards. He was a member of the Communist Party. He felt like she'd betrayed the family. But after about a decade, they reestablished contact. And all the years that I've been going to Germany, I had contact with the older members of that family. It's the younger members of the family that I think no longer have much contact with East Germany. East-West relations are tenser than they have been. The marriage rate's up a little bit. Up to about 10% of marriages in Germany happen between an East German and a West German. They don't have as good a success rate, but that's probably not solely due to cultural differences between East and West, but because a lot of them are second marriages, and second marriages have a lower success rate. So sociologically, it's not clear that it's harder to get along if you're an East German and a West German. We know that the friendship data suggests real difficulties. We know also that East Germans are reporting lower life satisfaction. Here's the life satisfaction numbers. Darker green goes up toward the higher end. This is a scale of 0 to 10, and the highest we get here is 7.5. So you're seeing numbers in the West that range from about 7.1, if you like, to 7.4. And the numbers in the East are running from 6.77 on the low end up to about 6.9. So there are some satisfaction differences. This graph shows you the movement from east to west. There was always a very low level of outmigration even during the communist period, a huge spike when the wall comes down, dropping back down here. Something like 4 million East Germans, about a fourth of the population, has left and gone to West Germany. Now, a whole lot of West Germans have moved east for various reasons, some professional. One thing that matters is that the latest data suggests that only about 1.7% of top leadership positions in culture, business, and economics and politics are held by people of East German birth. 1.7%. Now, this is a country in which the East German population ratio is roughly 17% of the country. So as a rough rule of thumb, maybe 10% of the numbers that you would normally expect to be in leadership positions. About 72% of West Germans say that they feel German first, and West German, if at all, second. About 41% of East Germans answer that similarly. So there's a sense of alienation and frustration that grows there. I could say more about these personal things, but I want to come to the end now and give time for questions. Let's give a composite picture of the three points of this talk. First, the Springsteen point. There's a difference between a breakthrough and a real revolution. We see this all the time in politics. We get excited because a thuggish government gets thrown out, and we're excited about the people power or the sense of possibility that arises when in Arab Spring or the former Soviet Union there's a colored revolution, or all of a sudden, as the Dylan song has it, the chimes of freedom are blowing. And we think as Democrats, they're finally going to become democratic in a way that we understand, and most of the time, as a political scientist, I have to tell you that's not what happens. Most of the time, those democratic openings do not turn into real breakthroughs. And I think the jury's still out on East Berlin. As I said in that part of the talk, I really worry that if East Germans continue voting for more extreme parties, they might be abandoned by the West German party system in a certain sense. It's not clear what that will do to the coalition math of the country, but it's not a good thing for the future of the country if a part of the country is sort of not listened to by the major parties. Again, we haven't gotten there yet. That's what I worry could be a next step. Through Trump, I think we learn that Germany's better trade is a product of worse inequality. And I also hope that the president learns that you can't fix a capital flow problem with trade tools. That's just the wrong way to go about it. It won't work. And it's why the Germans have been able to evade a serious conversation about this issue for as long as they have, because we keep making dumb arguments, and they point out these are dumb arguments. And so we don't get very far. Through my host family, I think we can learn that East Germany has been dealt heavy blows by the loss of people, the loss of identity, the thinness of connections to the West. I think this is a huge problem. And none of these three problems can really be fixed by the passage of time alone. We've said that for a long time. We point out problems in Eastern Germany, and we say, yeah, but it's only been X number of years. Give it more time. I don't think any of these three problems are problems that are really going away with time, because mechanically things are working against us in the sense of a democratic society that feels at peace with itself and therefore can live in harmony with its neighbors. I think, and this is my bottom line, Germany needs desperately to invest in itself once again. It needs to improve its infrastructure in East and in West to benefit its citizens and to care for those refugees that will return home and integrate those who will stay. By this I mean that Germany needs to stop exporting these savings abroad and enjoying the current account surplus that comes with that. Instead, it has to invest. It has to rebuild its schools. It has to get its daycare system in order. It has to get its pension levels up from the really miserly levels that they're at right now. It needs to build better hospitals and medical services. It needs to invest probably more in NATO. As grouchy as they sometimes get about it, about American lecturing on this topic, I don't care if it's 2%, but the Bundeswehr is no longer a serious military. And what are you going to do if Vladimir Putin starts rattling on the cages of your friends and neighbors just to the east of you? It's not a good situation. The Germans should also be investing more through the European Union in refugee resettlement and refugee education and training, and softening these anxieties that people feel who are already in an economy that doesn't work as well for them as it does for people in the western part of the country, softening these anxieties about refugees coming in and taking my job, even though they're physically not present. These anxieties are very, very real. So that's where I think the Germans need to go. And with that, I'll be happy. I found one joke. The symbol of Berlin is the bear. And I found one joke that combined bear and political science. So I'll put that up now and then take your questions. So that's it.
Thanks very much, Wade. We'll now, again, if you want to ask a question as usual, please come to the microphone, tell us who you are, and ask your question. We know some of you in about 5 minutes may need to leave for class, so please do so quietly, but we'll take questions as long as we have them. Please.
My name's Callie Millward, and I'm a dietetics major. Thank you for your lecture. It was super enlightening. And as students of our age, obviously we weren't alive during the whole Cold War, the coming down of the Berlin Wall, and I think the points you made were really important of things Germany can do in the future, but I kind of would like to know why you think it's important for us to remember this event of the coming down of the wall and what we can do moving forward in kind of helping this.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question, Kelly. Thank you. One point I would say is that it's good to remember the bad old days of the Cold War. It's good to remember how much human flourishing was diminished by these heavy-handed autocratic parties that didn't respect people's voice, that didn't respect their personal freedom, that didn't respect their wishes for their occupation, that didn't really leave their homes and families in a kind of protected sphere from public life, that didn't allow them to practice their religions, that didn't allow them to speak their conscience without fear of losing their jobs or their place of residence or their freedom. So that one piece of it is that, I think. A second thing that I think sort of remembering the Cold War is good for is that we like to sort of draw a line under a lot of that in 1989 and say, well, that was then and this is now. We're all done with that. But of course, that's not the way the world works. The forces that created those tensions are still with us in many ways. I mentioned at the end Russia. The geopolitics of Europe remains a very complicated thing. And the Russians, the Russian armchair psychologists for a minute are wounded by this loss of prestige and status and resources that comes from the collapse of the Soviet Union. And recognizing that loss is not a bad thing for us to kind of put ourselves psychologically in that position and understand where they're coming from time to time, which is not to say accommodating their wishes, but understanding what their priorities might be. And I think the last thing I would say is that, we live in a time where our democracies are under a great deal of stress. It's good to sometimes look at somebody else's stresses and just sort of imagine, where are our stresses? Where are our analogous stress points? How much of this are we suffering from at the same time? And, I think if it enters into our kind of personal vocabulary and habitus to think about authoritarianism as a threat, and to be people of integrity, to not say the words that non-democrats want us to say, to not signal that we'll be easy targets for people who want to limit and constrain our freedoms and our liberties, to let people know that there's a price to pay for violating democratic constitutional norms. I think those things are all incredibly important lessons that we can learn from this period. And, I could probably say more about that, but those are three that sort of jump to mind immediately for your not just for your generation. I mean, you put it in that way, but I hope my generation remembers that too, because we sometimes, start waxing nostalgic about the old days and forget some of those lessons. And I had to think about a lot as I wrote this talk too. Like, what do I really think we need to learn from this?
Hello, my name is Kyle, and I've got a quick question for you. Do you think that the development of more small businesses in Eastern Germany and other places with similar situations like in America, like in poverty-stricken neighborhoods, could help reduce the inequality and work on solving these problems?
It could. Recognize that East Germany had a lot of small businesses, and the Communist Party essentially made them illegal. And so it was very hard to sustain a small business through all those decades, and a lot of smaller or small-ish businesses who could packed up and went to West Germany. So a company like Carl Zeiss, which was famous for its location in Jena in East Germany, becomes Carl Zeiss of Bavaria. And so again, the loss of these economic powerhouses has been really painful for the East. Now, one weird point, so 100% endorse the premise of your question that these small businesses could be really, really helpful in the East. And the government has tried hard to promote and create these things. Again, you need consumption. You need demand if the small businesses are going to grow. And without that demand, investment isn't very rational. So until the German state changes its priorities and puts consumption power back into the hands of German citizens, it's going to be hard for those small businesses to flourish. Last point, small businesses in West Germany are fantastically productive. They're some of these export powerhouses. They're often world-beating companies with just 50 or 75 employees that have 80% of the market share in some really high value-added area. They're incredibly useful, incredibly lucrative. Unfortunately, of course, they increase the inequality in the country because they're family-held firms, they're not public companies. It's very hard to build wealth in Germany if you're not already wealthy. And that's one of the problems the country has. And so again, it's a very, very complicated and subtle set of problems. I would love to see more, bottom line, love to see more small businesses in Eastern Germany.
Hi, my name is Cameron Acey, and I'm majoring in neuroscience right now. But one thing that stood out to me from your lecture today was you mentioned with Bruce Springsteen's concert how it taught us the difference between an opening and a breakthrough. And with many new events and changes and ideas that are presented in the world today, I was wondering what we can do as citizens, or what specific components we can look at to differentiate between openings and breakthroughs, and what are certain aspects of those?
So there's two parts to that question. Let me take them in turn. One is sort of how do we recognize as just observers of politics? And so whenever you have a societal structure where all the power is sort of concentrated at the top, and the benefits are distributed down through these organizations to people at the bottom, then when you think that there's going to be a democratic opening, there's not going to be. So depending on how society is structured, if you have sort of diverse organizations with lots of competition, then I think the chances for a real democratic breakthrough are much higher. If you have oligopolistic structures that are very sort of pyramid shaped with a few people at the top controlling resources, channeling down to their supporters at the bottom, it's extremely difficult for those places to sort of sustain a democratic breakthrough. Really, really hard to do. In terms of what can we do as active citizens of the world, I like to think of it a little bit like a disaster, a natural disaster, or like a disaster in your ward where someone is in real trouble. You know that when, say, a ward member loses a child in a car crash, there's going to be an enormous outpouring of sympathy and support right at the beginning. But what happens over the longer term? What kind of commitments are there to the longer term support of that family? And obviously we want to be part of wards and stakes that do that well over the long run. I think a similar analogy can kind of work a little bit with these democratic breakthroughs. They have a lot of enthusiasts at the beginning, people sort of willing to wave the flag on behalf of these things. But if you want to really support, political change in a country that you care about or a place that you care about, you have to be willing to pay the price of long-term engagement, because democratic politics cannot be sustained with short-term thinking. It just can't be. Now, it does become kind of automatic after a while as the social structure diversifies and lots of people are doing lots and lots of things in a kind of Madisonian way that somehow works out to promote and sustain democracy. But boy, at the beginning, it's really, really hard, and it feels at the start like these young democracies need a lot of friends. They need a lot of help. And so, sustained, consistent engagement is much better than, a quick engagement that dies out after a short time.
Hi, my name is Jackie. I'm a sociology major, and I was wondering if you could have a meeting with Donald Trump, what would you want to teach him based on your experience with the Berlin Wall? What do you think he needs to know about building walls?
Wow, what a great question. So obviously I would try to explain this economic piece to him,
Right.
because I think that if you recognize that a lot of these countries that he sees as predatory, as hurting us, are themselves also hurting from the system that they have generated. By the way, this is true of China as well. China is different because it saves even more than the Germans do, but it invests more than anybody ever has. And so they also run these big trade surpluses that anger him, but he should recognize that if he could help the Chinese to rebalance their economies, which some in the Chinese Communist Party want to do, unfortunately, through the most authoritarian means imaginable. This would actually be good for China and good for the United States. So these imbalances are really bad. I would build on the president's gut level instinct that these imbalances are a bad thing and try to explain how actually they hurt the countries that are generating them as much as they hurt us. And that there's a diplomacy that could lead those countries, not immediately, not overnight, because these changes are so painful. They're so difficult to do. But in the medium term, toward a much more balanced economy, I think that would be really, really helpful. I mean, on the sort of interpersonal questions of walls and so forth, I guess I don't know that this president's really open to persuasion. I think in a way, what worries me is that the things that a lot of citizens see happening at our border, the kinds of family division and so forth that a lot of us lament, are actually not a bug but a feature in his thinking. The more that he's able to show real pain in these real families, the more he can tell his supporters that he's serious about what he said he would do. So their credibility shows. And I don't know that you can convince a person who thinks that way about the destructiveness of that kind of politics, because I think over and over he's found that he's benefited from that politics. So why should I listen to some poli-sci professor tell me that that's a bad idea?
Right. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Steve, a TESOL graduate student. You touched on this a little bit already. South Koreans take Germany as a model for their future reunification, potentially. Are you suggesting that's a bad thing, or what are some things that they should watch out for? Do you have any specific insights on applying this to the Korean situation?
Yeah, so like the 30-second explanation of export-led growth is that it's not a crazy idea, that there are times when you want your government to force your people to save more and to give those resources to people who will invest them to increase the productive potential of the country for the long run. In the United States, we call this trickle-down economics. It does make sense sometimes. It just doesn't make sense when your country is capital constrained. So South Korea was capital constrained. It didn't have enough capital, and it wanted more investment. And so it looked to the Germans as a model for that. That wasn't crazy at all. The problem is that it's worked too well for the Korean. South Korea is not in a currency union. So when the South Korean won appreciates, because it's running a current account surplus, then that makes its products more expensive, and it allows South Koreans to consume more from abroad because their currency is now more powerful, and that brings the current account down again. So these balances can be restored through the currency price. Because the Germans don't have control of their own currency because they're in the euro, that sort of rebalancing mechanism is broken in Europe. So the South Koreans are less of a danger in my eyes than the Germans are, because the South Korean, there are some breaks on the way that the South Koreans do this.
So to add to that, sorry, so on the North Korean side, thinking of social and political accommodation, any key points here that?
I mean, I think the key points, my key point on this is that the South Koreans ought to learn from Germany that you don't want a hasty collapse of your communist neighbor, because it's going to create all kinds of expectations that they're going to put you in a terrible bind. Now, the way the Kohl government managed that bind was to do populist things like give East Germans West marks in replacement of their East marks, which led to a lot of inflation and a lot of difficulty in Germany. The South Koreans would face similar kinds of incentives. So they should be doing everything that they can to sort of make sure the North Korean regime liberalizes without collapsing overnight. I think that collapse overnight has been, on balance, a really difficult thing for the Germans to manage. It'd be even harder for the South Koreans to manage.
Hi, I'm Mason McCloud. I'm an economics major, and I'm in your Poli-Sci 150 class, and you've talked about how at the end of her term, Angela Merkel's going to step down this time. Yeah. She's not running for re-election. Today you spoke of potential solutions to this problem that Germany's having with their growing inequality. Do you see any potential for the successor that Merkel has named for solving any of that inequality going forward in the way that you think it should be solved?
Yeah, sure. The woman who is now the party leader, but not obviously the chancellor, is Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer, and she's a former governor of a state. She's now a cabinet member. She's a very accomplished politician. She's younger than Merkel. Seems to have a bright future. She's a Christian Democrat, so a center-right politician. And the kinds of things that I would tell a center-right, and often have told center-right politicians in Germany, there are a lot of things that you can do. First of all, you have very high taxes on consumption, and you need more consumption in the country, so you should lower your VAT taxes. Secondly, you should make investment a lot easier, which is something the Christian Democrats are always talking about doing. But my point is, you can't really make investment more attractive without the demand from the economy to soak up the extra product that you create. So you could do R&D subsidies to companies. I think that makes a lot of sense. Science and technology subsidies. You could spend more on universities, which would be a good idea in Germany. You could also continue to build on these Christian democratic politics around the family by building a more generous child allowance, doing more to really make good on your promises to have universal daycare for pre-K kids. So there's a number of things that a Christian Democrat could do that would all have the effect of either increasing consumption and therefore lowering savings, it's the same thing, or increasing investment. Either or both of those are the critical need in Germany, and there's lots of things the CDU under, she goes by AKK, under AKK could do to lead Germany and Europe, I would say, into a better future, soften the conflicts with the United States. And I guess the last thing I would point out, something I said in the talk, is they could spend more on the Bundeswehr, because the Bundeswehr, you know, I mean, it's so funny to think about it. A country that's famous for the technology it creates has planes that won't fly, has tanks that won't roll, has APCs that won't carry people. I mean, it's just a complete mess. So they should be spending more on that and getting the army in shape.
I'm Amelia. I'm studying political science. You kind of mentioned the mistake that brought down the wall, and I think I know what broadcast you're talking about. I've seen that clip. I was just wondering, how did the West Berliners, maybe your host family, and you react to that?
They were pretty fired up. I wasn't there when it happened, so I've only heard secondhand stories. But I was in Berlin not too long afterwards and stayed with one of their close their family members there in the west side of the city. She was a little nervous, honestly. She lived right near the wall, within about 400 yards of the wall. And she was a little freaked out by all the changes that had happened. But by and large, the family was overjoyed by this. What it really meant was that when you were a pensioner, when you were really old in East Germany, you could travel to the West. That was not a problem. If you stayed, let the West pay your pension. But as a young person with family, you couldn't travel freely. So their younger generation could all of a sudden come to visit for family events, for golden anniversaries and those kinds of things. And all of a sudden, the family could really be together much more. And I think that was a huge, it was greeted with huge enthusiasm by this family. But of course, they were a family with East German roots. And I'm not sure that was universally true. I think for a lot of West German families, there was an initial feeling of, wow, this is really good for the East Germans, and hooray for them. But then after a while, it was a little bit like when your cousins come to stay, your poor cousins come to stay for a while. And, you know, when it's a week, it's okay. But, you know, after a couple of months, it feels like, well, you know, when are you going back home again? And there was a sense through I don't mean that literally. They weren't literally staying with West German families. I mean that there was a solidarity charge and increased taxes and spending, and that started to make West Germans nervous after a while. And it was certainly a backlash. There's 1,000 jokes about East Germans and West Germans sort of not understanding one another.
Hi, I'm a media arts student, or pre-media arts student. And so I'm interested in like comparing these things. What is different or similar about the socioeconomic division between West and East Germany and our own socioeconomic issues here in America?
Okay, well, what's the same is that their inequality is about as high as ours when it comes to their market income. So our take-home pay would leave us both as relatively unequal societies. What the Germans then do is redistribute a lot of that. And this goes back to a comment I make to the Christian Democrats, is that you don't like to do all this redistribution. You wouldn't have to if market income was more equal. And so we redistribute from what's called a Gini coefficient of 51, which is very unequal, down to about 40. The Germans redistribute from the same 51 down to 29. So they become a much more equal society after taxes and transfers happen than we do. That's one part of it. Another similarity is that they do most of their social provision through insurance programs. So they're not like, and that's what we do in this country as well. We have health insurance, we have unemployment insurance, we have old age pensions, and we contribute to them and our employers contribute to them, and that's how they build up the funds that will pay for us when we need them. Germany does the exact same thing. So they're not like the UK, which really does have socialized medicine, for example. The Germans have, private doctors and private hospitals and nonprofit hospitals that are paid for by the contributions of people who work out of their paycheck every month. So in that sense, again, fairly similar. I think one big difference is that they really believe in funding families. This is fairly new in Germany. It's been more common in Scandinavia, but they spend a lot of money on child subsidies. So everybody who has a child, irrespective of whether they're a high-earning family or a low-earning family, gets a monthly stipend of a couple €100, $250 or so, to pay for clothes or art camp or extra books and crayons and things like that. So that's something that on the kind of the social side that the Germans do quite a lot different from less means testing and more universal programs than the United States has, though less universal than the Scandinavians would have, for example. Just a couple of images to work with.
Hi, I'm Louis Larson. I'm a pre-business major, and I actually served my mission in Frankfurt, Germany. I had a companion from Dresden, and we talked a lot about the differences between East and West Germany, and he felt like the younger generation is kind of throwing those lines drawn between East and West away, and they feel a lot more unified. I'm wondering what your thoughts on that would be and how the younger generation is going to affect the future of East Germany.
Yeah, I mean, the public opinion data doesn't show it. So young people in some ways are more alienated if they stay in East Germany. Now, a lot of young people from East Germany are ending up in West Germany. And particularly this is true of young women. And so one of the problems is that, you end up with a lot of small towns where there's a lot of older folks and a lot of young men, but not a lot of young women. And this is not exactly a recipe for people living in social harmony with one another. So there's a demographic piece to this that is very important. But again, that poll that I mentioned earlier where East Germans tended to feel East German and not German, young respondents, these were under 20, so very young respondents, maybe even younger than your companion, felt more East German than the older ones did. So that was kind of surprising to me, actually. And that's why one of the reasons I say that I don't think the passage of time alone will really change these dynamics that we've gotten into. I think the dynamics have pretty deep roots now. I do think there is, though, to go back to the question we had about small and medium-sized firms, there is a kind of young East German who is in this sort of dynamic tech startup sector, often in Berlin, sometimes in Dresden or Leipzig, that is every bit as ambitious and on the ball and excited about the future of their company as any young West German that I've seen. So I think there are definitely a lot of examples of young people in sort of Tech Alley in Berlin, which is actually in the eastern part of the city, that would kind of speak to your friend's sense that there's a dynamism there. There's a sense that these divides don't mean as much as they used to. But I would caution against generalizing too much from anything that happens in Berlin. That was always the big mistake of the GDR, to think that because things in Berlin worked reasonably well, the whole country must be doing okay. And I think that was manifestly not the case. So.
Okay. Thank you for joining me again for thinking great.